She was a refugee, making a name for herself in the U.S.
She was born in Cuba. She wanted to be an artist. She wanted to be somebody.
And she finally met a man that felt like home.
He was also an immigrant. That was the common bond the two of them had.
She begins to fall for this guy. The stars begin to twinkle.
But when torrential rains reveal a horrific crime, the entire community is put on high alert.
The body had been mutilated and burned in that stream.
It almost looked like an autopsy left undone.
This was obviously not a run-of-the-mill murder.
We had some kind of cycle on our hands.
When two suspects implicate one another, the cards of fate send investigators spiraling down a dark and twisted trail.
He made the police really creeped out.
He believes that he can read minds and that he can control people.
This wasn't a man that she was dealing with. This was a devil.
There was blood splatter all over the walls.
He was cool. He was collected. He was a killer.
Just 30 miles north of Midtown Manhattan lies the village of Spring Valley, a diverse suburb divided between Ramapo and Clarkstown, New York.
Spring Valley historically was a resort town and beautiful area, mountains, trees, rivers.
It's a big mixture of different communities that do get along together very well. In particular, within the Hispanic community.
In the summer of 1998, Spring Valley had been hit with a torrential rainfall as part of an unusual weather phenomenon crossing the country.
At that period of time, the U.S. was under the influence of El Nino. And what that meant for our area here in the Northeast was rain, rain, rain.
Our parks was flooded, our streets, people complaining about their yards, their houses being flooded.
But by Monday, June 13th, the rain has finally subsided.
A local resident went out to inspect the water levels in the creek in his backyard.
He was checking the drainage because, all the rain that they've been having.
Whenever there's rain and stuff, he gets a little flooding, and because of El Nino, it was a lot more rain.
However, when the man reaches the edge of the creek, he notices something unsettling.
It looked like a body wrapped in some sort of plastic.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
And horrified, he immediately ran to the phone, called 911, and said, "I think you need to get here now."
Investigators quickly respond to the man's home.
It's back here.
I was led to the backyard of the caller that called it in. The body appeared to be wrapped in some kind of plastic and set on fire, and it was already decomposing. I knew that this was going to be a very difficult case to even start to put together.
There was no trace evidence, nothing you might expect at a typical crime scene.
The police were able to at least ascertain that it appeared to be a young Hispanic woman, probably in her early 20s.
Investigators hope fingerprints will help ID their victim, but they're soon hit with a horrific realization.
There's no hands.
They're gone?
To my shock, the hands on this body were missing. They were actually hacked off.
This was something that really took them back.
I'm realizing that based on the hands being cut off and the body being set on fire, that this was done to try and prevent us from identifying who this person was.
The detectives didn't have a hand, let alone a print. So they had to call the medical examiner.
After the medical examiner removes the burned plastic, he discovers even more horrifying details.
Not only are her hands severed, she was disemboweled as well.
But regardless of the body's condition, the medical examiner is able to ascertain the cause of death.
Massive blunt force trauma to the head.
This lady was brutally murdered with some kind of foreign object, maybe a sledgehammer.
They believe those blows to the head probably caused instant death, which is good because the severing of the hands, the mutilating of the body were most likely done post-mortem, so she didn't have to suffer through that.
Unfortunately, a large part of her face is indistinguishable, so they are still unable to identify her.
We really had nothing to go on, but luckily I've worked with this awesome officer from Clarkstown who is also a sketch artist. So I immediately contacted him.
He was able to duplicate one side of the face to match the other side of the face so that you now had a face in its entirety.
This sketch was then put to all the newspapers and television stations in the New York tri-state area.
And before long, they get a call from a local man named Stanley Ellis.
Anderson.
Hi. I'm calling about the girl in the newspaper.
He immediately recognized the sketch, particularly the gap in the teeth.
It was his missing friend, 20-year-old Beatrice Alvarez.
He said that was my friend Beatrice. I hadn't seen her in over a month. I wondered what happened to her.
On the cusp of adulthood, Beatrice Alvarez had already experienced more than many people do in a lifetime.
She was a refugee from Havana, Cuba. She endured many trials along the way, but she was resilient.
Her and her family, they ended up in Queens.
But like many hoping to achieve the American dream, the obstacles they faced proved to be insurmountable.
They did fall on hard times, and unfortunately it broke the family up. The brother and the sister, they moved away. The mother ended up, I believe, in a homeless shelter.
Although she did come from this background where her family struggled, Beatrice did not let that stop her.
She became a hairdresser to earn a living. She was talented in that way.
Anybody that she came in contact with instantly fell in love with her because she had just had that charming personality.
She always had a smile. She was always upbeat. She was always determined.
But doing hair wasn't Beatrice's true passion.
She liked to do hair as a profession, but her heart and soul was really much into the fine arts, and she wanted to be an artist.
One of her prized possessions was her sketch pad, and she took it with her everywhere she went.
She wanted to be somebody. She wanted to live the artist life.
She was trying to aspire to reach the American dream.
Having spent much of her life alone, Beatrice also yearned for companionship. And during the spring of 1998, she thought she'd found just that in local shop owner Felipe Rivera.
Hey.
Hi.
How was work?
It was good. A little slow, but it gave me time to work on my sketches.
She is in love with him and is ready to start this life with him. However, she then meets his friend, Vinicio.
Hola, Felipe.
Vinicio.
Vinicio walks in, and that's all that she can see.
Hey, Vinicio, this is my girl, Beatrice.
Nice to meet you, Beatrice.
Nice to meet you.
You two want to grab some lunch today?
Ah, man, I can't. I have to stay behind and man the store.
Felipe encouraged her to go get lunch with Vinicio.
Hey, you two be good.
They decide to go out for lunch together, and that was it. She's totally into this guy.
It was one moment where they were actually alone together, just talking and getting to know each other, and sparks started to fly.
These are amazing.
Thank you. I want to be an artist full time, but city can be a lot, you know?
Trust me, I get it.
Vinicio was also an immigrant. He came from South America, and that was the common bond the two of them had. He's 32, and he seems to have his stuff together. He's got his own place. He's got a job, a good job, too.
Vinicio was working at a military manufacturer.
It's not easy to survive here, but hard work and determination will get you a long way.
You think so? Feels kind of hopeless sometimes.
I won't let you give up. You got real talent, B.
She opens up herself to a situation where she begins to fall for this guy. The stars begin to twinkle. It's always that, for lack of a better term, that apple in the garden, that forbidden fruit.
Listen, I've actually got some connections. I think I could help you.
Really?
Yeah.
That'd be amazing.
Ultimately, Beatrice decided that she would leave her boyfriend and go live with Vinicio Valverde.
But now, after receiving a call from her friend, Stanley Ellis, detectives believe Beatrice Alvarez is the woman found brutally murdered and dismembered in a local creek.
Yeah, that sketch looks exactly like her.
Her hands had been cut off, and she had been disemboweled, burned.
Very dangerous, maybe deranged person that will go to these kind of extremes. We had some kind of cycle on our hands.
"20-year-old Beatrice Alvarez was an artist chasing her dreams when she fell in love with 32-year-old Vinicio Valverde.
They felt they had the same likes, and it was their life stories were about the same, how they immigrated from another country to come here for a better life.
Beatrice believes that she has found her soulmate, her match. This is the man that is going to help her really build that American dream.
But now Beatrice's promising future hangs in the balance.
Her friend believes she was the woman police found, burned and dismembered in a local creek.
It's one thing to kill a person. It's another thing to cut their stomach open and then cut off their hand. That speaks to a sociopath.
When was the last time you saw Beatrice?
It's been a few weeks.
He said they knew each other from working at the salon and used to talk and hang out quite often.
Then one day, Beatrice was gone.
It was really just quite sudden. One day she just doesn't show up and never showed up again.
I don't see her for weeks. And then her boyfriend shows up for a haircut appointment.
Hey, Stanley.
Hey, have you seen Beatrice?
He says, what's going on? Is she okay?
Stanley says he was surprised by what Vinicio said next.
She left me for another guy.
He just casually says, well, one night she got into a car with a musician and drove off.
A musician?
Yeah. I don't know his name, but she left me for him.
Did he say where they went?
Nope. He didn't give me any other details.
After speaking with Stanley, investigators are able to confirm his hunch about his missing friend.
Rockland County was very fortunate to have a brilliant medical examiner.
Once they had a name, they were able to use DNA evidence to confirm her identity. They were certain Beatrice was their deceased victim.
But when they attempt to deliver the tragic news to Beatrice's next of kin, detectives hit a wall.
I did everything I could to reach out to the mother, but unfortunately, due to her being homeless, I couldn't locate her.
As Beatrice's family had been dispersed really across the country, it was very difficult to track down the next of kin.
Thanks.
But eventually, the brother called, and I actually spoke to him on the phone, and he was informed that his sister was killed. Unfortunately, during my career, I've made too many death notifications, and no matter how many you do, it does not get easier. And this was probably one of the worst ones that I had to do, because not only did I have to make a notification that a loved one was dead, but they were brutally murdered.
Beatrice's brother has no idea who would want to do this to his sister.
The distance had made it hard to keep in touch. He didn't know anything about who Beatrice was living with, who her friends were, nothing.
Detectives are eager to speak with Beatrice's ex-boyfriend, Vinicio Valverde, about the mysterious musician she supposedly ran off with prior to her disappearance.
Now, we may have a suspect. Is that what led to her death?
But then, detectives get a promising break in the case.
Come in.
Detective Jones, Yonkers PD.
Yonkers is a suburb of North Manhattan, about 40 minutes southeast of Spring Valley.
I heard about the case you were working on and it sounded extremely familiar.
He said they had someone in their jurisdiction that committed almost the same similar type of sadistic homicide.
Check it out.
The Yonkers detective explains that in August of 1990, a woman named Rosie Vasquez was brutally murdered in their jurisdiction.
Yonkers police said that they had arrested and tried a gentleman named Bradford Wise for mutilating his girlfriend Rosie's body almost in a similar fashion to what happened to Beatrice.
Rosie was a small, petite Hispanic girl who was then post-mortem terribly mutilated. It fit all the same pattern of Beatrice's murder.
However, when it went to trial, the jury found Bradford not guilty. He was acquitted of all charges and walked out a free man.
We were sure it was him based on the circumstantial evidence, but we didn't have enough physical evidence to convince the jury.
After he was acquitted of the crime, he still calls the police and taunts them with details about where they can find different parts of Rosie's body.
It's been absolutely maddening.
The police can't do anything about it because double jeopardy, meaning he can't be rearrested and retried for a crime he was already arrested and tried and acquitted of.
But Yonkers police are convinced if Bradford got away with murder once, he could have tried to do it again.
If it quacks like a duck, it must be a duck. So Bradford became the #1 suspect.
It started to really sound like we had a serial killer on the loose.
Detectives in Spring Valley, New York, investigating the brutal murder of 20-year-old Beatrice Alvarez, have just received a visit from Yonkers police.
Yonkers detectives say they handled a case similar a few years earlier, and the alleged killer, Bradford Wise, was never incarcerated for the crime.
It started to really sound like we had a serial killer on the loose.
Thanks for passing this along, Detective.
Absolutely.
Investigators know that if there really is a serial killer at large in their community, they need to act fast.
I've got my guys searching for him as we speak. We'll be in touch.
They start trying to find Bradford to talk to him.
But the next day, their fervor comes to a screeching halt.
Anderson. Oh, hey, Detective Jones. Any sign of Bradford?
Bradford had recently been arrested on arson charges in a neighboring community. He'd been in jail at Westchester County, awaiting trial since late May.
Since police believe Beatrice was killed in early June, it would have been impossible for Bradford to commit the crime.
I'm so sorry to get your hopes up.
It's okay. We appreciate your help.
Just let me know if there's anything else that I can do.
Thanks, Jones.
That deconstructed the whole idea that they had their guy.
It wasn't Bradford.
Damn.
With their strongest lead now a dead end, detectives shift their focus to their victim's most recent ex-boyfriend, Vinicio Valverde.
Hi, are you Mr. Valverde?
Yes.
So the detectives asked Mr. Valverde if they could speak with him about Beatrice Alvarez.
At the mention of Beatrice's name, Vinicio immediately got emotional.
Yes, come in. I still can't believe she's gone.
Vinicio invites the police into his apartment.
And something inside immediately catches the attention of detectives.
What caught my eye right away was this makeshift shrine, or whatever we want to call it.
It had upside-down prayer cards. It had pictures of women, some with pins in them, and it also had what appeared to be a pentagram on the bottom.
And in that shrine was a photo of Beatrice Alvarez.
It really caught my eye, but Mr. Valverde, he didn't seem too nervous about it.
What's that?
Oh, It's supposed to give you good luck.
He said it was some spiritualism that he hoped would bring her back to him since she had left, and that the shrine was devoted to Beatrice's return.
Even though she was deceased, he was hoping she would return to him in spirit.
It's our understanding that Beatrice left you for a musician shortly before she was murdered. Is that correct?
Yes. It broke my heart.
He's not able to provide any other defining characteristics about the musician or where they may have gone.
I asked him, how did he meet Beatrice? And it was through a friend that he knew by the name of Felipe, who worked in the city.
Beatrice had been dating Felipe. They were living together.
When Beatrice and I met, it was like boom, fireworks.
He said he never intended to steal his friend's girl, but they had a connection and neither one of them could resist.
But apparently he treated her bad.
Vinicio says Beatrice opened up to him about her relationship with Felipe, and it raised cause for alarm.
He said Felipe was abusing Beatrice and kept her locked up in a room.
He was keeping her like a prisoner.
Spring Valley detectives are speaking with Vinicio Valverde about the murder of his ex-girlfriend, 20-year-old aspiring artist, Beatrice Alvarez. According to Vinicio, Beatrice had a tumultuous relationship with her other ex, Felipe Rivera.
He would hit her. He would lock her up.
How do you know this?
She told me.
Beatrice had told him that he was keeping her like a prisoner. He was trying to poison her. He was abusive, and she couldn't get away fast enough.
Vinicio says he knew he needed to step in to save Beatrice.
He was able to convince her that if she left Felipe and left with him, that he can give her a better life. She was so excited to start this new life that she actually goes back to the shop, breaks up with her boyfriend, and literally packs up what she has, all her life savings and stuff, and goes with Vinicio and ends up moving in with him in Spring Valley.
But apparently I couldn't make her happy.
Beatrice told him she was going to leave him and left with a musician who lived in Manhattan.
Just like that, Beatrice was gone. Vinicio said he hadn't seen her since.
But despite Beatrice leaving with the mysterious musician, Vinicio believes someone else is responsible for what happened to her.
You know, I think Felipe did this.
Vinicio started crying, very, very tearful, and had immediately pinned her murder on her former lover, Felipe.
Felipe Rivera did this.
He's heartbroken. He's upset. He was assuming that she went back to Felipe and he started his abuse again and possibly took it too far.
There's no telling what he's capable of.
Detectives fear Vinicio might be right.
Police now have to interview Felipe. If even half of what Vinicio was saying is true, maybe he is the real suspect.
We locate him in the city, and we have a conversation with him and ask him if he would come back with us to Spring Valley. And he was more than willing to.
I just can't believe that she's gone. Even though things did not work out between us, I'll always have love for that girl.
Basically, he tells us he was in love with Beatrice, that was the love of his life, and that his friend, who was supposed to just go out on a lunch date with her, Mr. Valverde, ends up taking his girlfriend.
Is it true that you were controlling of Beatrice when you were together? Abusive?
What? Never.
When they tell Felipe all the horrible things his friend Vinicio has said about him, he kind of loses it a little.
I mean, if anything, Vinicio was the abusive one. She told me so.
Felipe's like, wait a minute. She told me that Vinicio was the one who is the abusive one. And so now you got, he said.
She could not stand him. I mean, he was crazy. She wanted my help to get her out.
Basically, she's now asking Felipe for money and stuff, and she wants to go back.
I feel guilty for even introducing her to him in the first place. I mean, he's shown me his true colors before.
This is where it takes a really bizarre turn.
Felipe told us that he knew for a fact that Valverde practiced some kind of black magic, and that he believes that he can read minds and that he can control people.
It's a stunning claim, but is his story true?
As Felipe is telling us about this black magic, I'm really still not sold on it. And then Felipe is telling me how he was trying to give Vinicio a job in his shop.
This was a few months before Vinicio and Beatrice met.
Vinicio Valverde was trying to offer his services of being what you would, I guess, call a mind reader, a psychic, someone that can heal people.
Felipe thought Vinicio's services would be a great addition to his shop, but shortly after being hired, the situation took a chilling turn.
This looks good.
Something's not right.
What do you mean?
I guess he felt that the energy in the store needed to be shifted.
A sacrifice must be made.
And so he had a dove with him, and he wanted to sacrifice the dove in the store to purify it.
Wait, Vinicio, this is too much.
Fine. You just don't understand.
Mr. Valverde instead took out a syringe and put it into the dove, drew out some blood, and then put a drop of the blood from the dove in each of his eyes.
Vinicio thought he had power through black magic, power over women, power to control situations. And this is how he used these sacrificing techniques and other rituals.
Was Beatrice Alvarez just another one of Vinicio's sacrificial lambs?
It's beyond sociopathy. It's beyond psychopathology.
Homicide detectives in Spring Valley, New York, have just learned that Vinicio Valverde was exhibiting some chilling behavior before his ex-girlfriend, 20-year-old Beatrice Alvarez, was killed and dismembered.
Vinicio was known to practice black magic and did show some violent tendencies.
Beatrice's other ex, Felipe Rivera, says he witnessed it firsthand after hiring Vinicio to work in his shop.
I'm open to many different spiritual practices, but that was too much, even for me.
Felipe was like, I can't be having this in my shop.
The tapes of service Vinicio was providing were just way too extreme, so Felipe stopped having him work there.
I mean, we remained friends afterwards. I just thought he was a good guy at heart who had gotten too deep into black magic. But now I believe I was wrong.
And when detectives dig deeper into Vinicio Valverde's background, they discover even more disconcerting information.
Vinicio stole a book on demonology from the New York Library. He was trying to do these evil spells on his ex-wife.
Right there, that threw up a flag right away, because now that took my mind back to this memorial that's in Mr. Valverde's apartment.
In that shrine back in his apartment, there was a picture of a woman with pins stuck in it, and that was his ex-wife.
They really started looking into this stuff, realizing that, wait a minute, this is not a call to action for a loved one to come home. This shrine was to take control of someone's spirit.
But are Vinicio's spiritual practices really the signs of a deranged killer?
The detectives did their research and learned that whenever someone who practices black magic kills somebody, they keep a trophy of the person to keep their spirit under control in the afterlife.
They must take a body part and keep it close to them. And as long as they have that body part, the soul cannot come back to haunt them or hurt them.
So they felt like if Vinicio really did this, he may have some parts of Beatrice in his home, most likely her hands, since they know that they were missing from her body.
On July 14th, Spring Valley police execute a search warrant at Vinicio's apartment, and inside the bedroom, they make an alarming discovery.
To my shock, there was blood everywhere.
There was blood splatter all over the walls. There was blood on the floor.
As soon as I flipped the mattress over at the head part, you could see a big red stain that appeared to be blood.
Obviously, things are taking a different turn now after the find of this blood.
But that's not all they find.
I recall going into one of the dresser drawers, and I found female fingernails and human teeth.
And they find a hammer, and what they remember from the ME's report was that Beatrice's body was hit, blunt force trauma to the head.
There was a saw and a large knife, so you could see that these were probably the murder weapons.
Investigators also locate something near and dear to Beatrice, her sketchbook.
So I had already learned that Beatrice did not go anywhere without her sketchbook. That was her world.
She absolutely would not have left it behind. So why was it there?
But one crucial piece of evidence is still missing: Beatrice's severed hands.
I'm now convinced that the hands are somewhere in there. But it's a small room, and I turned that room upside down. I couldn't find it. So my next thing was I reached out to an agency that had cadaver dogs. The dog kept hitting on this small closet, and I went in the closet. I took all the clothes out of the closet, emptied the closet out.
And they're looking and they're looking. Dogs know, and the handler knows this dog is sensing something, but they just don't see anything.
But then the dog starts to get on his hind leg and starts pointing up. And so the police are looking up.
The handler looked up inside the closet, and he saw what appeared to be a false ceiling.
I see the handler reach up, and he pulls down this fake, and
Down dropped a hand, a mummified hand.
Spring Valley investigators have just made a series of gruesome discoveries inside the bedroom of 32-year-old Vinicio Valverde.
Police believe that Vinicio killed his ex-girlfriend, Beatrice Alvarez. They found blood spatter and other human remains inside of his apartment.
But the most shocking evidence of all is located in the bedroom closet.
I see the handler reach up, and he pulls down this fake, and
Down dropped a hand, a mummified hand.
I hear him yelling, goes, "I found what you're looking for." The only problem was it was mummified.
Since the hand is mummified, obtaining the forensic evidence to officially link it to Beatrice Alvarez will be especially challenging.
They needed to rush it to the medical examiner and see what he could do.
No matter how hard or where I checked, I could not find the other hand.
Fortunately, the medical examiner has a plan to rejuvenate the fingerprints from the hand found in Vinicio's closet.
He had perfected a method to rehydrate mummified hands. And so, given his technique that he had developed, we were able to rehydrate the hand.
They get a fingerprint impression and they send off the prints for testing.
And finally, we got that break where it came back that that hand did belong to Beatrice Alvarez.
For investigators, this proves without a doubt Vinicio is their man. Now all they need is a confession.
They take him into custody and bring him to the police headquarters.
We found some very interesting things at your place, Vinicio.
Once they tell him the hand was in your apartment, it matches Beatrice. Does he break down at this point? Absolutely not. He is not admitting to anything.
Well, I didn't kill her.
He was calm, he was cool, he was collected, he was a killer.
You guys must have planted it.
So as a last-ditch effort, he now tries to blame the police for planting the hand in his closet, which is absurd.
Someone is framing me. I swear.
At this point, detectives are done listening to Vinicio's excuses.
He never really owned up to it, but based on the overwhelming evidence, we were convinced already that we had enough.
Vinicio Valverde is charged with second-degree murder for the killing of Beatrice Alvarez.
He was not charged with murder in the first degree because you need more mitigating factors.
First-degree murder is very difficult to prove because you have to have the perfect set of circumstances to prove first-degree murder. In this instance, the cops did not have witnesses. The body wasn't found until way after the fact.
And Vinicio definitely isn't going down easy.
While he was pending trial, there was a moment where he tried to kill himself with a bedsheet.
He tries to end his life so he doesn't have to face his punishment.
Thank God the corrections officers were on duty and they caught it right away and they prevented him from taking his own life.
After his failed suicide attempt, Vinicio is strictly monitored until his trial begins in July 1999.
This is a person who was aloof, who really didn't have too many social connections, but heavily relied on connecting with the spiritual world.
And as the prosecution presents their case, they explain how Vinicio's connection to the spiritual world intersected with a dangerous obsession that led to murder.
It was my view of the evidence that we had that this was what you would kind of call a crime of passion.
The theory of this is that Mr. Valverde met this gorgeous young lady, instantly fell in love with her. He was very jealous of her, very controlling of her.
And his involvement with black magic was starting to make her feel really uncomfortable.
Prosecutors say that eventually, Beatrice had enough.
Where do you think you're going?
I can't stay here anymore, Vinicio.
You lost your mind?
I'm going. You're not who I thought you were.
Beatrice was planning to exit the relationship.
And that was the ultimate slap in the face for a person like this. It was an insult to his masculinity, to his alleged powers of black magic, and he couldn't let that go.
It was my argument to the jury that if he couldn't have her, then nobody would.
So he carried out his most sadistic ritual yet.
First, her skull was bashed.
Show you who I really am.
And then, after she was killed, he proceeded to humiliate and dismember the corpse.
He found a way to remove her from this physical world in efforts to connect with her in the spiritual world so that she would never leave him.
After that, Vinicio put her body in plastic bags and took it to a secluded area to burn.
But when the body didn't burn completely like he had hoped, he decided to take what was left and throw it in a local creek.
For a while, Vinicio thought he got away with murder, but then the storm hit.
He didn't expect that weeks later it would flood so bad to push her body downstream, where she was eventually discovered.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
After a week-long trial, it takes jurors only 5 hours to return with a verdict.
It didn't take long for the jury to come back with a verdict of guilty. And Vinicio was convicted of second-degree homicide.
Mr. Valverde was sentenced to the maximum under the law of 25 years to life. He is currently serving that sentence. At the trial, there were some family members that did attend on behalf of Beatrice, so it was really satisfying that we were able to bring the family members of Beatrice Alvarez some sense of justice, given the viciousness of this crime.
He was denied parole in May of 2023.
With her killer now behind bars, Beatrice's memory lives on in those who knew and loved her.
We lost a major.
May 21st, 1924. Chicago was slipping into the quiet warmth of a late spring evening, the kind of evening that made the city feel almost gentle. Streetcars rattled along polished rails. Well-dressed couples wandered beneath rows of budding trees. Children laughed in neighborhoods where parents believed the world still obeyed familiar rules. It was the kind of day that promised nothing unusual, nothing unforgettable. Yet somewhere among those orderly streets, two young men believed they were about to prove that intelligence could conquer morality, that preparation could defeat justice, and that a human life could become nothing more than a piece on a chessboard. They had rehearsed every detail, every conversation, every mile of the journey, every lie they would tell when it was over. Long before anyone realized a boy had disappeared, before detectives searched muddy roads and before newspapers filled their front pages with black headlines, the ransom letter had already been written. The rope had already been purchased. The acid waited in its container. Even the automobile had been rented under a false name. They imagined themselves standing above ordinary criminals, untouched by panic, untouched by guilt. They believed they possessed something more dangerous than cruelty. They believed they possessed certainty. For months they had entertained a single intoxicating fantasy. The perfect crime. Not a crime driven by poverty. Not revenge. Not jealousy. Not desperation. Simply the desire to prove that two extraordinary minds could outthink an entire legal system. One of them spoke several languages before reaching adulthood. Professors admired his memory. Scholars praised his intellect. He could spend hours observing birds with scientific precision, identifying species most people would never notice. The other had graduated from university while most teenagers were still attending high school. Charming, confident, and raised among unimaginable wealth, he moved through society with the ease of someone who had never been told that certain doors were closed. They were sons of privilege. Children of respected families. Young men whose futures appeared limitless. No one looked at them and imagined murder. That assumption became their greatest weapon. The victim never expected danger because danger did not look like a stranger hiding in an alley. It looked familiar. It smiled. It spoke politely. It belonged to the same social circles. It carried the confidence of people who had never needed to earn trust because it had always been handed to them. Some crimes begin with anger that explodes without warning. Others begin with fear. This one began with conversations. Quiet conversations held in expensive homes, during long drives through Chicago's affluent neighborhoods, in whispered discussions where morality slowly dissolved into theory. Murder became an intellectual exercise. Kidnapping became a logistical puzzle. Human life became a variable inside an experiment designed to answer one impossible question. Could anyone truly commit the perfect crime? History would remember their names. Not because they succeeded, but because they believed they could. The tragedy at the heart of this story is not only that a 14-year-old boy lost his life. It is that the people responsible convinced themselves that his life had value only because taking it would satisfy their curiosity. In their minds, another human being ceased to exist as a son, a friend, a student, a child returning home for dinner. He became evidence in a theory they desperately wanted to prove. The illusion did not last long. Every perfect plan contains imperfections invisible to those who create it. A fingerprint forgotten. A witness overlooked. A sentence spoken too confidently. Or, in this case, something so ordinary that almost anyone would have ignored it. A pair of eyeglasses. They rested near a drainage culvert outside the city, silent and insignificant against the earth. To an untrained eye, they appeared to be another discarded possession. To investigators, they became the first crack in a masterpiece that existed only inside the minds of its architects. Those glasses would eventually expose a lie. That lie would unravel another. Then another. Until two young men who once believed themselves intellectually untouchable found their carefully constructed world collapsing beneath the weight of details they never imagined could matter. Years later, Legal scholars would study the courtroom. Psychologists would debate the motives. Philosophers would argue over responsibility, free will, privilege, and the seductive danger of believing oneself superior to ordinary morality. Filmmakers would recreate the story. Writers would revisit it. Students of criminal justice would continue examining every decision, every mistake, every coincidence that transformed an almost impossible mystery into one of the most famous murder cases in American history. Yet beneath every analysis lies a much quieter truth. Before the headlines. Before the courtroom speeches. Before the endless debates over genius and insanity. There was a family waiting for a boy who never came home. A mother expecting to hear footsteps at the front door. A father with no reason to believe that an ordinary afternoon had already become the dividing line between the life they knew and the nightmare that would follow. The newspapers would eventually become fascinated with the killers. Their education. Their wealth. Their psychology. Their relationship. Their astonishing confidence. Readers could hardly look away. America found itself captivated by a story that seemed impossible to understand. How could two brilliant young men, surrounded by every advantage society could offer, deliberately choose violence for no reason beyond the thrill of proving they were clever enough to escape punishment? That question has echoed for more than a century. Perhaps because it refuses to offer a comfortable answer. People prefer to believe evil arrives wearing an obvious disguise. They search for visible warning signs, dramatic histories, unmistakable expressions of hatred. But some of history's most disturbing crimes challenge that belief. Sometimes violence emerges not from chaos but from calculation. Not from uncontrollable rage but from detached curiosity. Not from people excluded by society but from those embraced by it. That is what made this case so deeply unsettling. Everything about the perpetrators contradicted the expectations of the public. Everything about the crime contradicted reason. And everything about their downfall proved that arrogance can be far more destructive than ignorance. Because in the end, they did not fail because detectives possessed supernatural insight. They failed because they believed they could not fail. That single conviction shaped every decision they made. It encouraged risks they never needed to take. It convinced them their intelligence was stronger than evidence. It persuaded them that ordinary investigators could never understand extraordinary minds. But crime has never cared about IQ. Evidence does not respect reputation. And truth has a remarkable way of surviving even the most elaborate attempts to bury it. This is the story of two young men who tried to transform murder into an intellectual achievement, of a 14-year-old boy whose future was stolen in pursuit of another person's fantasy, and of an investigation that demonstrated one enduring reality. No matter how brilliant the criminal believes himself to be, perfection is often undone by the smallest detail. The smallest object. The smallest mistake. And once that first crack appears, even the grandest illusion begins to collapse. There was something almost theatrical about Chicago in the early 1920s. The city stood at the crossroads of prosperity and corruption, where polished automobiles rolled past crowded sidewalks, where fortunes were built as quickly as reputations were destroyed, and where every newspaper seemed to carry another story of gangsters, bootleggers, political scandals, or impossible ambition. America had entered the Roaring Twenties, an era that celebrated wealth, speed, and excess. Jazz drifted from fashionable clubs long after midnight. Expensive suits and silk dresses reflected a confidence that the future belonged to those bold enough to seize it. It was a decade intoxicated with possibility, and perhaps that same intoxication made people believe that intelligence alone could solve every problem, conquer every obstacle, and even rewrite the rules that had governed human behavior for centuries. Among the families who represented the highest levels of Chicago society were the Leopolds and the Lebs. Their names carried respect. Their homes reflected extraordinary privilege. They lived in neighborhoods where manicured lawns, elegant architecture, and private chauffeurs were ordinary parts of daily life. These were families whose children received opportunities unavailable to almost anyone else. They attended the finest schools. They traveled. They studied languages, literature, science, and philosophy. Their futures seemed carefully arranged long before adulthood arrived. No one could have imagined that those same advantages would someday become part of one of the darkest criminal cases in American history. Nathan Leopold Jr. did not resemble the popular image of a future killer. He appeared quiet, reserved, almost awkward. Books fascinated him more than parties. Nature often interested him more than people. Birdwatching became an obsession, not a casual hobby. He could spend hours studying migration patterns, memorizing species, recording observations with remarkable precision. Friends and professors recognized his astonishing memory. He mastered multiple languages while still very young. Academic achievement followed him almost effortlessly, reinforcing a belief that his mind operated differently from everyone around him. Richard Lubb was different. Where Leopold seemed withdrawn, Lubb possessed confidence that attracted attention. He enjoyed conversation, excitement, and social recognition. His intelligence expressed itself differently, through quick thinking and effortless charm rather than quiet scholarship. Graduating from the University of Michigan at such an unusually young age made him something of a celebrity among those who admired academic excellence. Adults predicted remarkable careers for both young men. Success appeared inevitable. Yet beneath the admiration lay something far more complicated. Exceptional intelligence does not guarantee emotional maturity. Academic brilliance does not automatically produce wisdom. Knowledge and empathy are not the same thing. As the two young men grew closer, their conversations began moving beyond ordinary academic interests. Detective fiction fascinated them. Criminal investigations fascinated them. They discussed famous murders not with horror but with curiosity, analyzing mistakes as though reviewing strategic failures in a game. Fictional masterminds who manipulated police became objects of admiration. The challenge of deception seemed more exciting than the human suffering left behind. At some point, the boundary separating imagination from reality began to weaken. Theories gradually became possibilities. Possibilities became plans. Leopold was particularly fascinated by philosophy, especially his own interpretation of Friedrich Nietzsche's writings. Over time, he convinced himself that extraordinary individuals could exist beyond conventional morality. Many scholars have since argued that this interpretation fundamentally distorted Nietzsche's ideas, reducing complex philosophical concepts into a dangerous justification for personal superiority. Whether through misunderstanding or deliberate self-deception, Leopold increasingly embraced the belief that exceptional people should not be constrained by ordinary ethical rules. It was an intoxicating idea. If ordinary laws existed only for ordinary people, then what obligations remained for someone who believed himself extraordinary? History has shown repeatedly that this question can become devastating when answered without humility. For Leopold and Lubb, it offered permission rather than caution. Their friendship became an echo chamber in which dangerous ideas encountered little resistance. Each reinforced the other's confidence. Each admired the other's intellect. Instead of questioning increasingly disturbing conversations, they encouraged them. What might have remained isolated fantasies in one mind gained momentum through agreement. Every discussion made the impossible seem slightly more achievable. Psychologists have often observed that destructive beliefs become stronger when shared. Isolation can challenge an irrational idea. Partnership can strengthen it. Neither young man appeared driven by financial desperation. Neither suffered the kind of deprivation commonly associated with violent crime. In many respects, they already possessed everything society encouraged people to pursue: comfort, status, education, opportunity. Ironically, abundance left them searching for something else: excitement, superiority, the thrill of proving themselves different from everyone around them. There was another dangerous ingredient quietly shaping their thinking: youth. At 18 and 19 years old, both were intellectually gifted, but neither possessed the emotional perspective that often comes only through experience. The certainty of youth can be remarkably persuasive. Doubt feels unnecessary. Consequences appear distant. The future seems infinitely negotiable. Decisions made in moments of arrogance rarely reveal their true cost until much later. For Leopold and Loeb, confidence evolved into something far more hazardous. They no longer wanted merely to discuss criminal perfection. They wanted to demonstrate it. The plan they eventually designed reflected careful preparation rather than spontaneous violence. Every practical detail received attention. They selected methods intended to minimize suspicion. They discussed transportation, false identities, disposal of evidence, communication with the victim's family. Their confidence grew with every completed task. Preparation itself became evidence, at least in their minds, that success was inevitable. Each successful step strengthened the illusion that failure belonged only to less intelligent criminals. But planning often creates its own blindness. The longer people spend perfecting a strategy, the more difficult it becomes to recognize its weaknesses. Every assumption begins supporting every other assumption until confidence replaces skepticism. Questions disappear because certainty has already supplied every answer. Somewhere during those months of preparation, they stopped seeing themselves as ordinary young men contemplating murder. Instead, they imagined themselves as authors writing an unforgettable story. Detectives would become supporting characters. Newspapers would become an audience. Society itself would become an opponent they intended to outwit. The victim, tragically, occupied only a small role in their imagination. That absence of empathy remains one of the most chilling aspects of this case. Violence rarely begins with the first physical act. It often begins much earlier, when another person's humanity gradually disappears from consideration. Once someone becomes an abstraction instead of an individual, decisions that once seemed unimaginable begin to feel possible. The choice of victim would reflect that detachment in the most heartbreaking way. They did not search for someone who had harmed them. They did not seek revenge. They did not act from fear. Instead, they selected someone whose familiarity made the crime easier to accomplish. Someone young enough to trust. Someone unlikely to suspect danger. Someone who believed he was climbing into a car with people he already knew. The decision revealed a disturbing contradiction. The young men who admired themselves for intellectual sophistication relied on one of the oldest forms of betrayal imaginable, exploiting trust. Trust requires years to build. It can disappear in seconds. As May approached, their preparations accelerated. The rented automobile was arranged under a false name. Rope was acquired. A chisel, intended as the murder weapon, became another item on a carefully assembled list. Acid was purchased in anticipation of concealing the victim's identity. Even before a target had taken his final breath, the ransom letter already existed, waiting to transform tragedy into a calculated performance. Every completed preparation deepened their commitment. Turning back became more difficult. The fantasy had consumed too much time. Too much pride. Too much imagination. Neither appeared willing to admit that the plan itself represented a profound moral collapse. Instead, they interpreted hesitation as weakness. Soon, all that remained was choosing the moment. An ordinary afternoon. An ordinary neighborhood. An ordinary invitation that would sound harmless to a 14-year-old boy who had every reason to believe he would be home before dinner. What neither Leopold nor Loeb understood was that history often remembers crimes very differently from the people who commit them. They imagined future generations speaking about their brilliance, their audacity, their flawless execution. Instead, history would remember something else entirely: the life of a child cut short, the unbearable grief of a family, and the astonishing arrogance that convinced two gifted young men they could elevate themselves above conscience, above the law. And above the simple truth that no amount of intelligence can erase the consequences of taking an innocent human life. The morning of May 21, 1924, did not carry the feeling of destiny. It did not announce itself with dark clouds gathering over the city or with an uneasy silence that warned people to stay inside. Chicago awakened as it always had. Store owners unlocked their doors. Delivery wagons rolled across cobblestone streets. Office workers hurried toward another ordinary day, exchanging polite greetings without realizing that history was quietly arranging itself around them. Somewhere in the city, a 14-year-old boy was thinking about the simple concerns that belong to childhood. School, friends, family, the routine comfort of returning home before supper. There was no reason for him to imagine that someone he recognized would soon become the greatest danger he would ever face. At nearly the same moment, two young men believed they were standing at the threshold of greatness, not greatness measured by achievement or compassion, but by deception. They convinced themselves that if every detail unfolded according to plan, they would accomplish something no criminal before them had truly achieved. They would prove that superior intelligence could outwit every detective, every judge, every newspaper, and every reader who would eventually follow the story. That illusion would survive for only a matter of days. Because the perfect crime has always been less about perfection than about human overconfidence. Human beings forget. They improvise. They panic. They overlook what seems insignificant. Even the most disciplined mind cannot anticipate every coincidence, every witness, every unexpected turn of fate. Leopold and Loeb believed they had calculated everything except the one variable that has undone countless criminals throughout history, themselves. Their confidence became their blind spot. Their certainty became the first mistake. As investigators would later reconstruct the events of that spring afternoon, a picture emerged that was both chilling and strangely ordinary. There was no elaborate conspiracy stretching across states. No hidden criminal organization. No decades-long feud. Instead, there were two privileged young men sitting inside an automobile, waiting for an opportunity they had created with astonishing patience. Everything depended on one simple moment. One conversation. One invitation. One decision to open a car door. The tragedy that followed would permanently alter several families, ignite national debate, reshape discussions about criminal psychology, and produce one of the most famous courtroom battles in American legal history. Yet none of that was visible in those first quiet hours. History often disguises itself as routine until it is too late. When the headlines finally appeared, readers across the United States struggled to understand what they were seeing. The details sounded less like reality than the plot of a sensational crime novel. Two wealthy prodigies. A carefully planned kidnapping. A murdered child. A ransom scheme already in motion before the victim had even been reported missing. Every new revelation seemed more unbelievable than the last. But beneath the shock and fascination, another question slowly emerged. How does extraordinary intelligence become separated from ordinary humanity? That question has never been fully answered. Some point toward privilege unchecked by accountability. Others emphasize emotional immaturity. Some examine obsession, narcissism, or the dangerous reinforcement that can occur when two people encourage each other's darkest ideas. The truth is likely more complicated than any single explanation. This story does not offer easy villains or comforting conclusions. It presents two young men who possessed remarkable intellectual gifts while making catastrophic moral choices. It reminds us that intelligence and wisdom are not interchangeable, and that brilliance without empathy can become something profoundly destructive. As this story unfolds, there will be moments that feel almost impossible to believe. Small decisions will lead to irreversible consequences. Tiny pieces of evidence will outweigh carefully constructed lies. A single misplaced object will accomplish what endless preparation could not prevent. And in the center of it all will remain a boy whose life should have continued far beyond one spring afternoon in 1924. Before the investigators. Before the courtroom. Before Clarence Darrow delivered one of the most discussed closing arguments in American legal history. Before psychologists, journalists, historians, filmmakers, and criminologists spent generations examining every detail. There was Bobby Franks. A son. A brother. A friend. A 14-year-old child whose future ended because two young men wanted to test a theory. That distinction matters. The killers sought notoriety. The victim deserved remembrance. This case has endured for more than a century not because its perpetrators were brilliant, but because it exposed a timeless truth about human arrogance. It demonstrated that when people begin believing they are exempt from the moral rules that bind everyone else, intelligence itself can become a dangerous instrument. The greater their confidence grew, the less they questioned the path they were taking. The more they admired their own planning, the less they noticed the flaws hidden inside it. In the end, they would not be remembered as the architects of the perfect crime. They would become one of history's clearest examples of why such a crime has never truly existed. Because every decision leaves a trace. Every lie creates another lie. Every attempt to erase the truth leaves behind something that refuses to disappear. Sometimes it is a witness. Sometimes it is a memory. Sometimes it is nothing more than a pair of eyeglasses resting in the dirt beside a lonely drainage culvert. And sometimes, the smallest piece of forgotten evidence becomes the thread that unravels an entire illusion. This is the story of that illusion. The story of ambition without conscience. Of privilege without restraint. Of a family whose ordinary day became an unimaginable nightmare. And of two young men who believed they were clever enough to defeat justice, only to discover that no amount of brilliance can silence the truth forever. In the next chapter, we leave behind the headlines and the mythology surrounding the case and step into the world that shaped everyone involved, where the streets of Chicago, the expectations of wealthy families, and the hidden lives of two celebrated students slowly reveal how one of America's most infamous crimes began long before a single blow was ever struck. Chicago in 1924 was a city that seemed determined to outrun its own shadow. Steel rose toward the sky. Factories breathed smoke into the spring air. Streetcars clanged through neighborhoods where immigrants, businessmen, laborers, and millionaires all lived within the same restless metropolis, separated by only a few miles yet divided by entirely different worlds. The city pulsed with confidence. America had survived war, embraced prosperity, and entered an era that celebrated speed, innovation, and excess. Every week seemed to bring another architectural triumph, another business empire, another lavish party attended by the country's elite. Yet beneath that glittering surface, Chicago carried another reputation. The city had become synonymous with organized crime. Prohibition had transformed alcohol into a lucrative underground business. Gangsters battled for territory while newspapers chronicled shootings, corruption, and political scandals with alarming regularity. Violence existed in Chicago, but it usually followed familiar patterns. It belonged to rival gangs, desperate robberies, or disputes that escalated beyond control. People believed they understood what criminals looked like. They imagined rough hands, desperate faces, hidden revolvers beneath worn coats. They did not imagine polished shoes. They did not imagine tailored suits. They certainly did not imagine two young men raised in some of the city's most respected households. In the affluent neighborhood of Kenwood, life unfolded according to a different rhythm. Wide, tree-lined streets stretched past elegant mansions built from limestone and brick. Chauffeurs waited patiently outside impressive homes while gardeners tended immaculate lawns. Children attended prestigious private schools before returning to houses filled with books, expensive furniture, and every opportunity money could provide. The Leopold family belonged comfortably within this world. Nathan Leopold Jr. grew up surrounded by privilege so complete that many of life's ordinary hardships remained distant abstractions. His father had built considerable wealth through manufacturing and business. Expectations within the family centered on achievement rather than survival. Excellence was assumed. Education was not merely encouraged, it was part of the family's identity. Nathan responded by becoming exactly what everyone expected him to be. A prodigy. By the time most children struggled through basic grammar lessons, he displayed an astonishing ability to absorb languages. French, German, Latin, and several others came with remarkable ease. Professors who encountered him often remarked that his memory bordered on extraordinary. Facts rarely disappeared once they entered his mind. Scientific names, historical dates, vocabulary, legal principles, he retained information with almost mechanical precision. Yet intelligence, impressive as it was, did not necessarily translate into emotional connection. Those who knew Nathan often described him as reserved, awkward, and intensely private. Social situations seemed to exhaust rather than energize him. He appeared far more comfortable walking alone through forests with binoculars around his neck than attending lively gatherings with people his own age. Birds fascinated him. Not casually. Obsessively. He could spend entire afternoons documenting migration routes, identifying species from distant calls, and recording observations with meticulous care. The natural world offered something human relationships often did not: order. Every feather, every flight pattern, every seasonal movement followed rules that could be studied and understood. People were different. People contradicted themselves. People lied. People behaved emotionally rather than logically. Nathan increasingly viewed humanity through the detached perspective of someone more interested in observation than participation. Only a few miles away, another wealthy household was shaping a very different personality. Richard Loeb possessed many of the same intellectual advantages, but he wore them differently. Where Nathan withdrew into books and scientific study, Richard embraced excitement. Friends remembered his confidence, his wit, and his ability to move comfortably through social circles. Teachers praised his academic accomplishments, but classmates often noticed something else. He enjoyed winning. Whether through conversation, games, or intellectual debates, Richard seemed drawn to the satisfaction of proving himself just a little smarter than everyone else in the room. His achievements came early. Graduating from the University of Michigan at an unusually young age made headlines within academic circles. Newspapers celebrated gifted students who appeared destined to become influential lawyers, scholars, or business leaders. Richard fit that image perfectly. Handsome, articulate, and wealthy, he seemed to embody the promise of America's ambitious new generation. But appearances reveal only what people choose to display. Behind closed doors, Richard's interests stretched beyond textbooks and lectures. Detective fiction captured his imagination. He devoured stories in which brilliant criminals manipulated investigators, leaving behind mysteries so intricate that ordinary police officers appeared hopelessly outmatched. In these fictional worlds, intelligence itself became a weapon. Victory belonged not to the morally righteous but to whoever planned most effectively. It was entertainment. Until it wasn't. No one can identify the precise moment when fantasy begins transforming into possibility. The change is rarely dramatic. It happens gradually. A conversation here. An idea revisited there. A joke repeated often enough that it no longer sounds entirely like a joke. When Nathan Leopold and Richard Lubb grew closer, each discovered something intoxicating in the other. Recognition. Both had spent much of their lives being told they were exceptional. Both understood what it felt like to stand apart from classmates because of intelligence. Both enjoyed conversations that wandered into philosophy, literature, psychology, and criminal investigation. They challenged one another. They impressed one another. Most importantly, they reinforced one another. Ideas that might have faded if left alone instead gathered momentum. Psychologists often describe this process as mutual reinforcement. Two individuals, each possessing similar beliefs or fantasies, gradually strengthen those beliefs simply by sharing them. Doubts become weaker because someone else appears equally convinced. Moral hesitation loses its influence when another voice encourages the same dangerous conclusion. Their friendship became exactly that kind of environment. Hours passed discussing famous criminal cases. They analyzed investigations almost as chess players study famous matches. Where had detectives succeeded? Where had criminals failed? Which mistakes proved fatal? How could those mistakes have been avoided? These were not the questions of future police officers hoping to improve criminal investigations. They were the questions of young men imagining themselves on the opposite side. Outside their conversations, Chicago continued celebrating progress. Inside those conversations, another kind of future quietly took shape. Nathan brought philosophy into their discussions, particularly his fascination with Friedrich Nietzsche. Over time, he embraced a deeply distorted interpretation of the philosopher's ideas, convincing himself that certain extraordinary individuals existed beyond conventional morality. Modern scholars overwhelmingly reject this reading, arguing that it oversimplifies and misrepresents Nietzsche's work. But what mattered was not the philosopher's actual meaning. What mattered was what Nathan believed it meant. If exceptional people answered only to themselves, then ordinary moral rules became optional. Richard did not need to become a philosopher to appreciate where such thinking could lead. Together, they began constructing a worldview in which intelligence justified superiority, superiority encouraged detachment, and detachment slowly eroded empathy. None of this happened overnight. The transformation was subtle enough that people around them noticed nothing unusual. Parents continued expressing pride. Neighbors offered polite greetings. Professors praised academic excellence. No one suspected that beneath impeccable manners and extraordinary achievements, two gifted young men were slowly replacing compassion with calculation, convincing themselves that the greatest challenge remaining in life was not building something meaningful, but proving they could outsmart an entire society. Their world still looked perfect from the outside, and perhaps that was the most dangerous illusion of all. From the outside, their lives appeared almost enviable. Both Nathan Leopold and Richard Lubb belonged to families whose names opened doors long before introductions were necessary. Their parents expected them to become accomplished professionals, respected members of society, perhaps even leaders within Chicago's elite. Dinner conversations revolved around education, business, politics, and culture. Shelves overflowed with books. Tutors and professors nurtured gifted minds that seemed destined for remarkable futures. Neither family imagined that the greatest threat to those futures would emerge not from financial ruin or personal tragedy, but from ideas quietly taking root inside their own sons. There was little reason for concern if one judged only by appearances. Nathan continued excelling academically. His fascination with ornithology deepened, earning him recognition among fellow bird enthusiasts. He spent long hours documenting rare species, often traveling to secluded areas where he could observe wildlife undisturbed. Precision defined everything he did. His notebooks reflected careful organization, every observation neatly catalogued with dates, locations, and scientific terminology. It was a habit that revealed something essential about his personality. Nathan found comfort in systems, patterns, order. If something could be studied long enough, he believed it could be understood. Human behavior, however, refused to fit so neatly inside categories. Rather than accepting that uncertainty, Nathan increasingly viewed emotions as weaknesses that clouded rational judgment. Compassion, guilt, fear, these became less like natural human experiences and more like obstacles that prevented clear thinking. Richard approached life differently. He enjoyed excitement in ways Nathan rarely did. While equally intelligent, Richard possessed a restless energy that constantly sought stimulation. Friends recalled his sense of humor, his confidence, and his tendency to become bored once a challenge no longer felt difficult. Success came so easily in many areas of his life that ordinary accomplishments seemed incapable of satisfying him for long. It was an unsettling combination. One young man obsessed with intellectual theories. The other captivated by excitement and risk. Together, they began supplying what the other lacked. Nathan offered elaborate reasoning. Richard offered momentum. One justified. The other acted. Over time, those roles became increasingly intertwined until it was difficult to separate where one influence ended and the other began. Historians have debated their relationship for decades. Evidence suggests they shared an unusually close emotional bond, one that extended beyond ordinary friendship. Exactly how that relationship shaped their decisions remains a matter of discussion, but there is little disagreement that each exercised a profound influence over the other. They existed within a private world where conversations became more important than outside opinions, where shared fantasies gradually acquired the appearance of reasonable plans. Inside that world, morality became negotiable. Not because either young man lacked intelligence. Quite the opposite. Their intelligence convinced them they could explain away almost anything. Every objection seemed answerable. Every ethical concern became another argument to dismantle. Instead of asking whether something should be done, They focused almost exclusively on whether it could be done successfully. That subtle shift changed everything. Most people instinctively reject violent ideas before considering practical details. Leopold and Lubb reversed the process. They concentrated on logistics first. If a problem appeared technically solvable, moral questions gradually faded into the background. They admired detective stories because those stories rewarded cleverness. Again and again, fictional criminals escaped capture through careful planning, while investigators succeeded only when villains made avoidable mistakes. Leopold and Lubb became convinced that those fictional failures resulted not from the impossibility of committing a perfect crime, but from inadequate preparation. They believed they could prepare better. Much better. As the months passed, their conversations grew increasingly specific. Not abstract discussions. Concrete possibilities. Which methods attracted the least suspicion? How could investigators be misled? How could evidence disappear? How could a victim be selected without creating unnecessary risk? Each answer encouraged another question. Each question carried them farther from ordinary life. To them, planning itself became an intellectual game. What they failed to recognize was that every hour devoted to perfecting the mechanics of murder required ignoring the humanity of its eventual victim. Empathy had become inconvenient. And inconvenient things were quietly pushed aside. By early 1924, the fantasy had hardened into intention. The phrase perfect crime no longer represented an impossible ideal. It became an objective. They imagined newspapers marveling at an unsolved mystery. They pictured detectives exhausting every lead while the true perpetrators calmly watched from a distance, smiling at the failure of an entire justice system. In their minds, escaping punishment would not simply protect them. It would validate everything they believed about themselves. If they succeeded, they reasoned, it would prove they truly were exceptional. That dangerous belief transformed preparation into obsession. They rented an automobile under an assumed name, hoping to separate themselves from the crime before it even occurred. They acquired rope and a chisel, not impulsively, but deliberately, selecting items they believed would help them maintain control over every stage of the plan. They purchased hydrochloric acid with the intention of making identification of the victim more difficult, convinced that even after death they could manipulate the investigation through careful planning. Perhaps the most chilling detail was what came next. Before anyone had been kidnapped. Before anyone had been attacked. Before any grieving family even knew tragedy was approaching. The ransom letter had already been written. Its words waited patiently for a crime that had not yet happened. That single fact revealed how completely detached they had become from ordinary human emotion. For most people, the thought of harming another person creates hesitation. For Leopold and Lubb, hesitation had been replaced by scheduling. Every task occupied its place in the sequence. Transportation. The weapon. The disposal site. The ransom demand. The escape. Like engineers assembling components of a machine, they viewed each element separately, rarely confronting the reality that every step revolved around ending the life of an innocent child. The choice of victim required equally cold calculation. Random victims introduced uncertainty. Adults could resist. Strangers might become suspicious. Someone familiar would be easier. Someone young would be more trusting. Someone connected to Richard through distant family ties would have little reason to fear accepting a ride. The decision was horrifying precisely because it exploited something fundamentally human. Trust. Trust asks people to believe they are safe. It encourages children to enter familiar cars, greet familiar faces, and assume that people they know wish them no harm. Leopold and Lubb recognized that trust could become a weapon. Rather than seeing that realization as a reason to stop, they incorporated it into the plan. By the time spring settled over Chicago, there was remarkably little left to decide. They had convinced themselves that emotion would never interfere. That panic belonged to lesser criminals. That evidence could be controlled. That police officers would remain permanently one step behind. Most importantly, they believed intelligence itself guaranteed success. History would expose that belief as fatally flawed. Because intelligence can solve complicated equations. It can master languages. It can unravel scientific mysteries. But intelligence alone cannot erase conscience, cannot control every unpredictable moment, and cannot prevent the smallest overlooked detail from collapsing an entire illusion. As May approached, the city carried on without noticing the storm gathering beneath its polished surface. Families planned summer vacations. Students prepared for examinations. Children hurried home from school beneath the warm afternoon sun. Somewhere among those ordinary routines, a 14-year-old boy named Bobby Franks continued living the uncomplicated life expected of someone his age. Completely unaware that two young men had already reduced his future to nothing more than the final missing piece of an experiment they believed would change criminal history forever. The final days before the crime unfolded with an almost unsettling sense of normalcy. Nothing about the routines of Nathan Leopold or Richard Lubb suggested that they were standing on the edge of an irreversible decision. They attended to everyday responsibilities, spoke with family members, exchanged pleasantries with neighbors, and moved through Chicago with the confidence of young men who had never been forced to answer for serious wrongdoing. That ordinary appearance would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. When investigators reconstructed the timeline, they found no dramatic transformation, no sudden disappearance into secrecy, no visible collapse of mental stability. Instead, they found two intelligent young men who calmly wove preparations for murder into the fabric of otherwise ordinary lives. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One moment they discussed academic subjects. The next they debated methods of disposing of a body. One afternoon they sat at family dinner tables. Another they inspected roads outside the city, searching for a location where a victim might never be discovered. Their world had divided into two realities. One belonged to everyone else. The other belonged only to them. In that hidden reality, every practical problem seemed to have a practical solution. They drove through rural areas southeast of Chicago, eventually settling on a drainage culvert near Hammond, Indiana. It appeared isolated enough to conceal a body while remaining accessible by automobile. They studied the surroundings not with horror but with calculation, considering visibility, traffic, and the likelihood of discovery. To most people, it was simply another stretch of roadside landscape. To Leopold and Lubb, it became part of an equation. That equation contained almost everything except the one element they consistently underestimated: chance. No criminal investigation unfolds exactly as planned by either side. Witnesses appear unexpectedly. Weather changes. Mechanical failures occur. Human beings make decisions no planner can predict. The belief that every variable can be controlled has undermined countless criminal schemes throughout history. Yet confidence often grows strongest immediately before failure. Each successful rehearsal convinced them they were becoming more prepared. Each completed errand reinforced the illusion that perfection was within reach. By the third week of May, nearly every piece was in place. Only one decision remained. Who? The answer would come not through rage or personal conflict, but through convenience. Bobby Franks was 14 years old. He lived in the same privileged world they did, surrounded by family, school, neighborhood friends, and the ordinary expectations of adolescence. He was active, intelligent, and known to enjoy sports. Like countless boys his age, he trusted familiar faces. Richard Lubb was a distant relative, someone whose presence would not immediately trigger fear or suspicion. That familiarity became the opening they needed. It is one of the cruelest truths revealed by this case. Bobby was not selected because of anything he had done. He was selected because he happened to fit the plan. The decision stripped away individuality. In the minds of the perpetrators, he became interchangeable with the role they needed someone to fill. They were no longer thinking about a child with dreams, friendships, and a family waiting for him at home. They were thinking about logistics. History often remembers famous crimes through the names of those responsible. But before Bobby Franks became a victim remembered in history books, he was simply a boy living an ordinary day. That perspective is easy to lose amid discussions of psychology, philosophy, and courtroom drama. It should never be forgotten. Because every detail that follows begins with a life interrupted. As May 21st arrived, Chicago looked much the same as it had the day before. The city did not recognize that one of its most notorious criminal cases was about to begin. Parents watched children leave for school. Shopkeepers arranged merchandise in display windows. Office workers hurried through familiar streets beneath the warmth of late spring. Somewhere in that city, Leopold and Lubb made the final preparations they believed would secure their place in history. Not as murderers. As masterminds. That distinction mattered deeply to them. They wanted admiration for their intellect far more than they desired violence for its own sake. Murder, in their thinking, became the mechanism through which superiority would be demonstrated. They imagined investigators admiring the elegance of their planning, newspapers marveling at an unsolved mystery, and society reluctantly acknowledging that two exceptional minds had accomplished the impossible. Instead, history would remember something entirely different. Not brilliance. Hubris. Not perfection. Failure. The very qualities they believed guaranteed success, confidence, intellectual pride, and emotional detachment would ultimately contribute to their downfall. They had spent months studying fictional detectives, yet they overlooked a simple reality shared by every real criminal investigation. No matter how carefully someone prepares, reality refuses to follow a script. Tiny irregularities accumulate. Small inconsistencies attract attention. Minor mistakes become major discoveries. The irony is almost impossible to ignore. The men who believed they had outgrown ordinary morality remained subject to ordinary human error. They forgot that intelligence does not eliminate fatigue. It does not prevent distraction. It does not erase overconfidence. And it certainly does not guarantee control over events once they begin unfolding in the real world. As this story moves forward, the carefully constructed theories that occupied months of planning will collide with reality in a matter of hours. A boy will accept what appears to be an innocent invitation. A family will begin searching for someone they expect to return home. Detectives will confront a mystery unlike any they anticipated. And two young men, so convinced they had designed the perfect crime, will begin leaving behind the very trail of evidence they believed impossible. The city of Chicago still has no idea what is about to happen. Neither does Bobby Franks. For him, the afternoon promises nothing extraordinary. For Leopold and Lubb, it promises triumph. For history, it will become the beginning of a case that continues to be studied more than a century later, not because perfection was achieved, but because the illusion of perfection unraveled with astonishing speed. The next chapter begins with that ordinary afternoon, when routine gives way to horror, trust becomes a weapon, and a single decision to step into an automobile changes countless lives forever. The story of the Leopold and Lubb case is often remembered through the names of the two young men who committed the crime. Their intelligence, their background, their courtroom battle, and the questions surrounding their motives have filled books, documentaries, and legal discussions for generations. But before there was a famous trial, before newspapers debated philosophy and psychology, before lawyers argued about responsibility and punishment, there was a 14-year-old boy whose life was far more than a single moment in history. His name was Bobby Franks. To understand the true weight of this case, it is important to look beyond the headlines and remember that Bobby was not a symbol, not merely a name attached to a famous investigation, and not a detail in someone else's story. He was a child. He had a family. He had a daily routine. He had dreams that would never have the chance to become reality. Bobby was born into a comfortable Chicago family, the kind of family that represented the city's growing middle and upper classes during the 1920s. His father, Jacob Franks, was a successful businessman, and the family lived in a neighborhood where children could still experience the familiar rhythms of childhood, school in the morning, friends in the afternoon, and returning home to the people who loved them. The Franks family was part of the same broad social world as Leopold and Lubb. They were not strangers living in separate realities. They belonged to the same city, the same era, and many of the same social circles. That familiarity would later make the crime even more difficult for the public to comprehend. The danger did not arrive from an unknown figure in a distant place. It came from people who understood the value of trust. Bobby was described by those who knew him as a bright and well-mannered young boy. Like many teenagers of his age, he was navigating the transition between childhood and adolescence. He attended school, spent time with friends, and lived with the ordinary concerns of a 14-year-old. At that age, the future still feels endless. The world appears full of possibilities. A teenager may think about upcoming holidays, school achievements, friendships, hobbies, and the many experiences waiting ahead. The idea that life can suddenly change beyond recognition belongs to the world of adults, not children. For Bobby, May of 1924 was supposed to be another chapter in that ordinary journey. He was not involved in the conflicts, ambitions, or obsessions that would later surround his name. He had not chosen to become part of history. History chose him. That distinction is one of the most important things to remember about this case. The fascination surrounding Leopold and Loeb has sometimes overshadowed the person whose life was taken. Their education, wealth, and psychological profiles became subjects of endless discussion, but behind every debate was a family experiencing something far more personal than a historical event. They were not reading a newspaper story. They were searching for their son. They were facing the unbearable reality that a familiar routine had been broken and that the future they imagined for their child had suddenly disappeared. The Franks family tragedy reflected a fear shared by parents everywhere, the belief that home, family, and familiar surroundings provide protection. Parents teach children to be careful around strangers, to avoid danger, and to seek help when something feels wrong. But this case presented a more painful lesson. Sometimes danger does not announce itself. Sometimes it arrives wearing the appearance of familiarity. The circumstances surrounding Bobby's disappearance shocked Chicago because they challenged the assumptions people held about safety. The city was accustomed to hearing about crime, but this case felt different. It involved a child from a respected family, and it involved perpetrators who appeared to represent everything society considered successful. The contradiction was overwhelming. How could young men with education, wealth, and opportunity become responsible for such a devastating act? And perhaps an even more painful question: how could a young boy who was simply living his life become the center of such a tragedy? As newspapers began reporting the case, public attention quickly focused on the unusual backgrounds of the suspects. Reporters examined their childhoods, their academic achievements, their families, and their psychological beliefs. But the more attention shifted toward understanding the perpetrators, the more important it became to preserve the memory of the victim. Bobby was not important because he became part of a famous crime. He was important because he was a human being whose life had value before anyone knew his name. A 14-year-old boy should be remembered through the small details that make a person real. The conversations he had. The people who cared about him. The routines that shaped his days. The hopes he carried. The ordinary moments that families treasure because they never imagine those moments will become memories forever. In many ways, that is what makes the Leopold and Loeb case so haunting after more than a century. The story is not only about a shocking crime or a famous trial. It is about the collision between two completely different worlds. One world was filled with abstract ideas, intellectual pride, and a dangerous belief that human lives could become part of an experiment. The other was a family home where a young boy belonged, where his absence would be felt every day afterward. Bobby Franks never had the opportunity to define himself beyond the tragedy. He never grew older. He never discovered what kind of person he might become. He never experienced the ordinary milestones that shape a human life. Graduation. Friendships that last decades. Career dreams. Family moments. All the small experiences that seem ordinary until they are gone. That is the true measure of what was lost. Not only one day, not only one life, but every future moment that should have followed. As investigators would later reconstruct the events of that spring, they would uncover the decisions made by two young men who believed they were creating something extraordinary. They would examine evidence, question witnesses, and slowly reveal how a carefully planned crime had taken place. But before the investigation became a national spectacle, before courtrooms became stages for arguments about morality and punishment, there was a family waiting for answers. And there was a boy whose story deserved to be remembered first. Because every true crime case has evidence. Every investigation has suspects. Every trial has arguments. But before all of those things comes the most important truth. A victim was a person before they became a case. Bobby Franks was 14 years old when his life ended. And long before his name became connected to one of America's most infamous crimes, he was simply Bobby, a son, a student, and a young person with a future ahead of him. For the Franks family, life before May 1924 was not defined by tragedy. It was defined by ordinary moments, the kind that rarely seem important while they are happening, but later become the memories people hold on to most tightly. A family is built from those moments. A conversation during breakfast. A familiar voice calling from another room. A child returning home after a day outside. A parent watching their son grow older little by little, believing there will be countless more years to witness who he will become. Bobby Franks was living inside that ordinary world. He was not a historical figure. He was not someone who expected attention from newspapers or strangers. Like most young people, he was simply moving through the early years of his life, surrounded by the people and routines that made his world feel secure. The tragedy of his story is that the future disappeared before anyone had a reason to question whether it could. In the months before the crime, Chicago was a city experiencing dramatic change. New technology was reshaping daily life. Automobiles were becoming increasingly common. Young people were embracing new forms of entertainment and culture. The boundaries between childhood and adulthood were shifting as the modern world moved faster than previous generations had ever experienced. Bobby belonged to this new generation. He grew up in a time when possibilities seemed endless. The world was expanding around him, offering new experiences and opportunities. Like other teenagers of the 1920s, he lived between two stages of life, no longer a small child, but not yet an adult. Those years are filled with discovery. A young person begins developing their own identity. They form stronger friendships. They discover interests. They begin imagining the future. Every teenager carries countless possibilities that others cannot yet see. A teacher may see a student. A parent may see a child. A friend may see a companion. But behind all of those roles is a person still becoming themselves. Bobby never had the opportunity to complete that journey. The public attention surrounding the Leopold and Lubb case would eventually become enormous. Reporters would analyze every detail of the investigation. Lawyers would debate questions that extended far beyond the immediate crime. Experts would examine the minds of the defendants and attempt to understand how two gifted young men could make such devastating choices. But for the Franks family, those discussions could never replace what was lost. No argument in a courtroom could bring back ordinary evenings. No newspaper article could restore the future that had been taken away. No explanation of motive could make the pain disappear. This is one of the difficult realities of true crime history. Society often searches for explanations because understanding feels like a form of control. We study the offender's background, psychology, and decisions because the human mind wants to find a reason behind something that seems impossible to accept. But explanations are not the same as answers. Knowing why someone committed a crime does not erase what happened. Understanding the offender does not diminish the victim. And examining the person responsible should never cause us to forget the person who suffered most. The Leopold and Lubb case became famous partly because the perpetrators seemed so unusual. Their intelligence, education, and social status challenged common assumptions about crime. People struggled to understand how individuals who appeared to have every advantage could commit such an act. But perhaps the most important lesson from Bobby's story is that crime should never be measured only by the person who commits it. It must also be measured by the life that was taken. A 14-year-old boy represents more than his final day. He represents every possibility that existed before that moment. The person he might have become. The relationships he might have built. The contributions he might have made. the memories his family might have created. A single act of violence does not only affect the moment in which it happens, it reaches forward into every year that follows, changing the lives of everyone connected to it. For the Franks family, time would be divided into before and after. Before, a household with familiar routines, expectations, and plans. After, a family forced to live with an absence that could never be filled. This transformation is often one of the most painful parts of any violent crime. The victim's final moment becomes permanently connected to their identity in public memory, while the life they lived beforehand risks fading into the background. That is why remembering Bobby matters. Not because he became part of a famous case, but because he had a life before the case existed. The attention surrounding Leopold and Loeb created a strange imbalance. The defendants became subjects of fascination. People studied their intelligence, their personalities, their relationship, and their courtroom strategies. Their names appeared repeatedly in books and documentaries. Meanwhile, Bobby's story remained quieter. But quiet does not mean less important. In many ways, the quietness of his story is what makes it more human. He represented the countless victims whose lives do not become historical debates. People whose names do not appear in textbooks. People remembered most deeply not by the public, but by those who loved them. Every victim leaves behind a circle of people affected by their absence. Parents, relatives, friends, communities. The damage spreads outward, touching lives that were not present when the crime occurred but must continue afterward. That was true for Chicago in 1924. The city was fascinated by the mystery, but behind the headlines were real people experiencing real grief. While reporters searched for dramatic details, a family faced a loss that could not be summarized in a newspaper column. The investigation would eventually reveal the truth. The courtroom would eventually deliver a sentence. History would eventually decide how Leopold and Loeb were remembered. But none of those events could change the most fundamental fact at the center of the case. A young boy was gone. And the world continued without him. As the investigation began, detectives would follow a trail of evidence that would expose the arrogance behind the so-called perfect crime. The carefully designed plan would begin to break apart. The confidence of two young men who believed themselves untouchable would be tested by ordinary investigative work and unexpected discoveries. But before entering that investigation, it is necessary to remember what was at stake. This was not merely a puzzle for detectives to solve. It was not merely a courtroom battle between lawyers. It was not merely a debate about intelligence, philosophy, or punishment. At the center of everything was a child whose future had been stolen. Bobby Franks was 14 years old. He was someone's son. Someone's family. Someone whose life mattered long before his name became associated with one of the most infamous criminal cases in American history. And that is where the story must always begin. The importance of remembering Bobby Franks is not only about preserving the identity of a victim. It is also about understanding how an ordinary life can become the center of an extraordinary tragedy. When a crime becomes famous, public attention often moves quickly toward questions that feel easier to analyze. Who committed it? How did they plan it? What mistakes did they make? What punishment did they receive? Those questions are important. But they are not the beginning of the story. The beginning is always the person whose life was changed forever. For Bobby, that life existed far away from the theories and arguments that would later surround his name. He was growing up in a city experiencing rapid transformation. The world around him was changing, but his personal world remained centered on the familiar things that define childhood and adolescence. Family, school, friends, daily routines. The small experiences that quietly shape a person before they ever understand how meaningful those moments are. A young person rarely thinks about their own legacy. They are not aware of how many lives they influence simply by being present. They do not know that a conversation, a shared memory, or a simple moment of kindness may remain with someone else for decades. That is the tragedy behind many cases involving young victims. Their stories are interrupted before they have the chance to fully unfold. Bobby never had the opportunity to grow into the person he might have become. He never experienced the later chapters that every young person hopes to reach. The achievements, relationships, challenges, and discoveries that normally define a lifetime were replaced by a single event that overshadowed everything that came before. Yet his identity should never be reduced to that event. He was more than the victim in a famous criminal case. He was a young person living in a specific time and place, surrounded by people who knew him not as a name in a newspaper, but as part of their everyday lives. That difference between public memory and personal memory is important. To the nation, the case became a mystery. To investigators, it became an investigation. To lawyers, it became a legal battle. To historians, it became a study of crime, punishment, and psychology. But to those closest to Bobby, it remained a personal loss. A missing presence. An empty space where a familiar voice should have been. This is often the part of true crime stories that receives the least attention, yet it is the part that carries the greatest human meaning. Behind every investigation file is a family. Behind every courtroom argument is a person who cannot return. Behind every historical account is a life that existed before the crime ever occurred. The Leopold and Lubb case became famous because it challenged people's understanding of criminal behavior. The suspects did not fit the image many people had created in their minds. They came from wealthy families. They had impressive academic backgrounds. They appeared to represent achievement and opportunity. That contrast fascinated the public. But fascination can sometimes create distance. The more unusual the offenders appeared, the easier it became for people to focus on the mystery of their minds rather than the reality of the victim's loss. Bobby's story brings the focus back to what matters most. A crime is not significant only because of who committed it. It is significant because of who suffered from it. The investigation that followed would eventually reveal how a carefully planned scheme began falling apart. The confidence of two young men who believed they had created an impossible mystery would be tested by evidence they never expected. Their assumptions would collide with the careful work of investigators determined to find answers. But the search for justice was never only about proving a crime had occurred. It was about acknowledging that a life had been taken. Justice cannot restore the past. It cannot return lost years. It cannot erase grief. But it can recognize the value of the person who was harmed. It can establish responsibility. It can remind society that every victim matters, regardless of how famous or unusual the case becomes. More than a century later, the Leopold and Lubb case continues to attract attention because it raises difficult questions about intelligence, privilege, morality, and responsibility. But the strongest reminder from the case may be the simplest one. No theory is more important than a human life. No criminal's reputation should become larger than the person they harmed. And no investigation should begin by forgetting the individual at its center. Before the courtroom speeches, before the legal debates, before the psychological analysis, there was Bobby Franks. A 14-year-old boy. A member of a family. A person with a life that mattered. His story is the foundation upon which every other chapter of this case is built. And as the events of that May afternoon are examined, the focus must remain clear. This was not simply the story of a crime committed by two young men who wanted to prove they were extraordinary. It was the story of a child whose ordinary life deserved the chance to continue. On the afternoon of May 21, 1924, Chicago moved through another ordinary spring day. The city was alive with familiar sounds and familiar routines. Automobiles traveled along busy streets. Children finished their school lessons and began making plans for the hours ahead. Families continued with the small patterns that made up daily life, unaware that one event unfolding in a quiet corner of the city would soon become one of the most discussed crimes in American history. For most people, it was simply another Wednesday. For Bobby Franks, it began as an ordinary afternoon. He was 14 years old, at an age when life still carried a sense of routine and predictability. School, family, friends, and the small responsibilities of growing up formed the structure of his world. There was no reason for him to believe that the day would be remembered forever. There was no warning. No obvious sign that something terrible was approaching. That is one of the most unsettling aspects of the Leopold and Loeb case. The tragedy did not begin with a dramatic confrontation between strangers. It began with familiarity. It began with a young boy encountering people he had reason to recognize and trust. The two men waiting for him were not unknown figures hiding in the shadows. They were young men from the same social environment. They were educated. They were well-dressed. They came from families that represented success and respectability. Nothing about their appearance matched the danger they carried. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb had spent months imagining this moment. In their minds, the plan represented the final stage of an intellectual challenge they believed they had created. Every preparation, every discussion, every calculated decision had been leading toward this day. They had transformed a human life into a component of a plan. That was the most disturbing reality behind their actions. The crime was not born from a sudden explosion of anger. There was no argument that spiraled out of control. There was no moment of uncontrollable emotion. Instead, there had been time. Time to reconsider. Time to stop. Time to recognize what they were preparing to do. But each opportunity for reflection was replaced by another step forward. The idea had become a commitment. The commitment had become an operation. And the operation had reached the point where they were no longer discussing possibilities. They were acting. Leopold and Loeb had chosen their method carefully. They believed planning would protect them. They believed preparation separated them from ordinary criminals. They imagined themselves as observers of the system rather than participants within it. But their greatest mistake was also their most fundamental one. They believed the world would behave according to their expectations. They believed Bobby would become only a detail in their story. They were wrong. Because behind every plan involving a victim is a person who cannot be reduced to a role. Bobby was not a challenge. He was not evidence of their intelligence. He was not a piece in a philosophical argument. He was a human being. And that reality would eventually become impossible for them to ignore. The afternoon continued. People walked through neighborhoods without knowing what was happening nearby. Cars passed along roads without anyone realizing that one vehicle carried the beginning of a case that would soon capture national attention. The ordinary world continued moving forward while a terrible decision unfolded within it. After the crime, Leopold and Loeb attempted to maintain the appearance of normal life. This detail would later contribute to the shock surrounding the case. They did not resemble people overwhelmed by panic or immediate regret. Instead, they attempted to continue with the confidence of individuals who believed their plan had worked. They had imagined the aftermath almost as carefully as the crime itself. The ransom letter. The false trail. The attempt to confuse investigators. The belief that authorities would struggle to understand what had happened. But reality was already moving in a direction they had not predicted. The first signs of trouble appeared almost immediately. Their plan depended on control. Control over evidence. Control over witnesses. Control over information. But once a crime enters the real world, control begins to disappear. A single unexpected discovery can change everything. A single overlooked mistake can become the center of an investigation. And Leopold and Loeb, despite months of preparation, had already created the first cracks in their carefully designed illusion. The disappearance of Bobby Franks quickly became a matter of urgent concern. His family expected him to return. When he did not, uncertainty turned into fear. The search for answers began before the public knew the details of what had happened. At first, there was no complete picture. Only questions. Where was Bobby? Who had seen him last? What had happened during the hours after he left school? Every missing person investigation begins with fragments. A timeline. A last known location. A conversation remembered afterward. A detail that seemed unimportant at the time but later takes on new meaning. Investigators did not yet know they were entering one of the most unusual criminal cases of the decade. They did not know the suspects would come from wealthy families. They did not know the investigation would challenge assumptions about intelligence and morality. They did not know a small piece of physical evidence would eventually expose the people behind the crime. They only knew that a young boy was missing. And someone needed to find out why. Meanwhile, the two young men who believed they had created the perfect crime were about to discover that planning a crime and controlling its consequences were two completely different things. Their confidence had been built on the belief that intelligence could eliminate uncertainty. But uncertainty is part of every human action. The moment they chose to involve another person, their carefully designed scenario became vulnerable to reality. Every movement could be questioned. Every conversation could be examined. Every mistake could become visible. The perfect crime existed only in their imagination. Outside of that imagination was a world filled with investigators, witnesses, evidence, and human unpredictability. And that world was beginning to close in. The story of the crime itself would soon become known across America. Newspapers would publish shocking details. The public would struggle to understand how two young men with every advantage could commit such an act. But before the country debated the motives of Leopold and Loeb, before their names became symbols of arrogance and misplaced intelligence, there was a family facing the most painful uncertainty imaginable. A child was missing. And the search for the truth had begun. As the hours passed on May 21, 1924, the absence of Bobby Franks became increasingly impossible for his family to ignore. At first, there is always hope. A delayed return. An unexpected change of plans. A misunderstanding. Families often search for ordinary explanations before accepting extraordinary possibilities. The human mind naturally resists the idea that something terrible may have happened, especially when the person missing is someone young, someone loved, someone who was expected to walk through the front door at the end of the day. But as time continued, concern began replacing uncertainty. Questions started forming. Where had Bobby gone after leaving school? Who had spoken with him? Who had last seen him? Each question represented a small piece of a puzzle that investigators would spend days trying to complete. Meanwhile, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb continued attempting to follow the plan they had designed so carefully. They believed the hardest part was behind them. They believed the rest would be a performance. A false story. A carefully controlled sequence of events that would lead investigators in the wrong direction. Their confidence came from preparation. They had spent months imagining every possible challenge, convincing themselves they had already considered every mistake that could occur. But the human mind often has difficulty recognizing the weaknesses in its own plans. Especially when pride is involved. The same intelligence that allowed them to organize details also created a dangerous sense of superiority. They had studied criminals from books and newspapers, analyzed investigations, and convinced themselves that they understood how law enforcement worked. But understanding investigations in theory is very different from facing one in reality. Real investigators do not follow the script created by the person responsible. They follow evidence. And evidence has no interest in a person's reputation, education, or confidence. As news of Bobby's disappearance began spreading, the Franks family entered a nightmare that no parent should ever experience. The search was no longer about a late arrival or a simple misunderstanding. It became a desperate attempt to find answers. Every passing hour carried a heavier emotional weight. Families of missing people often describe that period as existing between two painful possibilities. Hope remains alive, but fear grows stronger. Every phone call creates a moment of expectation. Every unfamiliar sound raises the possibility of news. The world continues moving around them, but their attention narrows to one question. Where is he? The investigation quickly attracted attention because Bobby came from a respected family and because the circumstances surrounding his disappearance seemed unusual. Detectives began gathering information, speaking with people who knew him, and reconstructing his final known movements. At this stage, they did not have the complete picture. They did not yet know the identities of those responsible. They did not know they were investigating a crime planned by two young men from wealthy families. They did not know the case would eventually become a national discussion about morality, intelligence, and justice. They were simply trying to find a missing child. That focus is important because investigations often begin without certainty. Detectives rarely receive a complete explanation waiting for them. Instead, they build understanding piece by piece. A conversation. A timeline. A small inconsistency. A detail that seems insignificant until it connects with something else. For Leopold and Loeb, however, the confidence they felt after carrying out their plan began to create new problems. A person attempting to hide the truth must maintain consistency. Every false statement creates another statement that must be remembered. Every invented detail requires another explanation. The more complicated the story becomes, the more opportunities exist for it to collapse. The two young men had imagined themselves as the authors of a mystery. But they had forgotten that mysteries are solved by people who know how to search for what does not fit. Their first mistake was believing they were beyond suspicion. Their second was believing intelligence could replace caution. Their third was believing that a carefully designed plan could erase the unpredictable nature of human investigation. The city that morning had been unaware. By evening, a family was searching. By the following days, investigators would begin uncovering the first signs that this was not a random disappearance. And slowly, the carefully constructed world Leopold and Loeb had created would begin to collide with reality. The crime had been planned in secrecy, but its consequences could not remain hidden. A victim had been lost. A family had been changed forever. And two young men who believed they had created the perfect crime were about to learn that the truth does not need to move quickly to win. It only needs one opening. One overlooked detail. One person willing to keep asking questions. As the investigation continued, the attention of detectives would shift toward the physical evidence left behind and the strange circumstances surrounding the disappearance. The search for Bobby would become a race against time, but it would also become something more, a test of whether careful investigation could defeat a plan built on arrogance. And in the days ahead, the smallest details would begin telling the story that Leopold and Loeb had worked so hard to hide. The days following Bobby Frank's disappearance transformed a private tragedy into a public crisis. Chicago had seen countless crimes before. The city was familiar with headlines about violence, corruption, and criminal schemes. But this case carried a different kind of weight. It involved a young boy, a respected family, and circumstances that seemed impossible for many people to understand. As investigators worked to establish what had happened, the city watched and waited. For Bobby's family, every hour without answers brought another wave of uncertainty. For detectives, every unanswered question represented another challenge. For Leopold and Loeb, the attention surrounding the case created a situation they had never truly considered. A crime can be planned in isolation. But once it affects the world outside the plans of those responsible, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a story told by witnesses. A story reconstructed through evidence. A story shaped by people who were never part of the original plan. The two young men had imagined themselves controlling the narrative. They believed they could decide what investigators would discover and what conclusions they would reach. They had studied famous crimes and convinced themselves they understood the difference between those who were caught and those who escaped. But they had studied the end of criminal cases without understanding the beginning of investigations. They focused on the intelligence of criminals. They underestimated the persistence of investigators. The first days after the disappearance revealed an important truth about police work. Investigations are rarely solved through one dramatic discovery. More often, they advance through patience. Detectives gather small pieces of information that may appear unrelated at first. They compare statements. They examine timelines. They notice details that others overlook. The smallest inconsistency can become meaningful. A forgotten conversation. A detail that does not match. An explanation that creates more questions than answers. Leopold and Loeb had built their confidence around the idea that they were thinking several steps ahead of everyone else. Yet the investigation would soon reveal that intelligence does not belong to one side. The people searching for the truth were also capable of careful reasoning. They were also capable of strategy. And unlike the men who created the crime, investigators had something far more powerful working in their favor. Reality. Reality does not need to be invented. It does not require a complicated explanation. It simply exists, waiting to be discovered. As detectives began reconstructing Bobby's final known movements, they worked to understand the circumstances surrounding his disappearance. They examined the information available to them and searched for connections that could explain how a seemingly ordinary day had turned into a tragedy. Meanwhile, Leopold and Lubb continued attempting to maintain normal appearances. This was perhaps one of the most unsettling elements of the case. The young men who had committed such a devastating act did not fit society's expectations of criminals. They were not hiding in distant places. They were not figures from the margins of society. They belonged to the same privileged world that many people associated with success and respectability. That contrast fascinated the public and complicated the investigation. People often search for visible signs of danger. They look for something obvious. Something that separates the person capable of harm from everyone else. The Leopold and Lubb case challenged that assumption. It showed that background, education, and social status do not automatically determine a person's choices. A person's achievements can reveal their abilities. They do not always reveal their character. As the investigation progressed, the confidence of the two suspects began to face pressure. Maintaining a false reality requires constant effort. Every conversation becomes a test. Every question becomes a potential threat. Every person who knows a different piece of information becomes someone who could expose the truth. The perfect crime they imagined depended on silence. But silence is difficult to maintain. People remember. People compare stories. People notice when something feels wrong. And eventually, the smallest details that seem meaningless begin connecting. The tragedy of the case is that the evidence would not only reveal the actions of two young men. It would also reveal the dangerous gap between how they viewed themselves and how the world would ultimately view them. They wanted to be remembered as extraordinary. They wanted their intelligence to become the defining feature of their story. Instead, the investigation would reveal something very different. They were not defeated by a superior criminal mind. They were defeated by the reality they had ignored. A victim mattered. A family deserved answers. And the truth could not be permanently controlled by those who tried to hide it. The investigation was still in its early stages, and many questions remained unanswered. Detectives did not yet know the full chain of events. They did not yet know how closely the suspects were connected to the crime. They did not yet know that the case would become one of the most famous trials in American history. But they were moving forward. Step by step. Clue by clue. And somewhere within the evidence already gathered, there was a detail waiting to change everything. A small discovery that would transform suspicion into certainty. A piece of the puzzle that would bring investigators closer to the people behind the crime. The men who believed they had created the perfect crime had overlooked something fundamental. A perfect crime requires perfect control. And human beings are never as perfect as they believe themselves to be. The search for answers after Bobby Frank's disappearance entered a new and more urgent stage when investigators began focusing not only on finding a missing child, but on understanding the circumstances surrounding what had happened. In the beginning, every possibility had to be considered. A disappearance can have many explanations. A person may have left voluntarily. They may have encountered an accident. They may have become lost or found themselves in danger. Investigators cannot afford to assume too early, because every assumption can close a door that should remain open. But as detectives gathered information, one thing became increasingly clear. This was not a simple disappearance. Something had happened. The discovery that changed the direction of the case came outside Chicago, near a drainage culvert in a rural area close to Hammond, Indiana. The location was quiet compared with the crowded streets of the city. It was the kind of place where people passed by without paying much attention, a stretch of land that seemed disconnected from the daily movement of Chicago. Yet beneath that ordinary landscape was the answer investigators had been searching for. The discovery confirmed the fear that Bobby's family had been desperately hoping would not be true. Bobby Franks had not simply disappeared. He had been killed. For investigators, the moment marked a painful transition. A missing child investigation became a homicide investigation. The purpose was no longer only to locate Bobby. It was now to reconstruct what had happened, identify who was responsible, and bring the person or people involved to justice. For the Franks family, the discovery brought a devastating certainty. The uncertainty was gone. But certainty did not bring peace. There is a particular cruelty in learning the truth after desperately hoping for a different answer. Families of victims often describe this moment as the instant when fear becomes reality. The questions that had haunted them are finally answered, but the answers create a new kind of pain. Investigators now had a different challenge. They had a victim. They had a location. But they needed a path from that location back to the person responsible. Every crime scene tells a story. Not immediately. Not all at once. But through careful observation. A scene contains traces of decisions, movements, mistakes, human choices that remain behind even after someone attempts to erase them. The investigators examining the area understood that the smallest details could become important. What appeared insignificant at first might later reveal a connection. Evidence does not always announce its importance. Sometimes it waits for someone patient enough to recognize it. Among the items discovered near the scene was an object that would eventually become one of the most famous pieces of evidence in the case. A pair of eyeglasses. At first glance, they seemed ordinary. Small. Easy to overlook. The kind of object that could belong to countless people. But investigations often turn on exactly these kinds of details. The things people assume do not matter. The things left behind because someone believes no one will notice. The glasses became significant because of a rare design feature. They contained an unusual hinge mechanism that was not commonly found. To investigators, this transformed an ordinary personal item into something far more valuable. A question emerged. Who owned glasses like these? That question would eventually lead investigators toward Nathan Leopold. But before that connection was made, detectives had to work carefully. A single piece of evidence could not simply point toward a conclusion without verification. They needed to establish whether the connection was real or merely coincidence. This was the difference between suspicion and proof. The investigation could not be driven by emotion or assumption. It required patience. The discovery of the glasses also created a powerful irony at the center of the case. Leopold and Loeb had spent months attempting to eliminate evidence. They had imagined themselves capable of controlling every detail. They had planned how information would be released and how investigators would interpret what they found. Yet one small personal possession threatened to expose everything. The same mind that had carefully analyzed criminal investigations had failed to consider the simplest possibility. Something could be forgotten. Something could fall. Something could remain behind. The investigation was beginning to reveal the weakness hidden inside the idea of the perfect crime. Complex plans often depend on many small things going exactly right. If one detail fails, the entire structure can collapse. As detectives examined the evidence and began connecting information, they also looked more closely at the people connected to the case. They considered relationships, opportunities, and possible motives. They began moving beyond the physical location of the crime and toward the lives of those who might have been involved. This process required separating appearance from reality. The suspects would not necessarily look like suspects. The people who appeared successful and respectable could still be capable of terrible decisions. That realization was difficult for the public to accept. Many people believed crime belonged to a certain type of person. Someone from a troubled background. Someone lacking education or opportunity. The possibility that two young men from wealthy families could commit such a crime challenged those assumptions. But investigators were not searching for a stereotype. They were searching for evidence. And evidence was beginning to tell a story. A story of careful planning. A story of deception. A story of two young men who believed they had created something impossible to solve. The discovery at Hammond was the moment when that belief began to fall apart. The investigation now had a direction. The questions were becoming sharper. Who had planned this? Who had the ability to carry it out? Who had made the mistake that left behind the first undeniable clue? The answers were closer than anyone realized. Because the most important evidence in the case was not hidden in some distant place. It was already connected to the people responsible. And soon, detectives would begin following the trail from the quiet roadside where Bobby was found back into the privileged neighborhoods of Chicago, where two young men had believed their intelligence placed them beyond suspicion. The discovery of the eyeglasses changed the direction of the investigation, but at first, it did not provide investigators with an immediate solution. A clue is only as valuable as the questions it creates, and the glasses created one question above all others. Who did they belong to? In a city as large as Chicago, a personal item could easily seem impossible to trace. Thousands of people wore glasses. Thousands of people owned similar objects. A small piece of evidence could become meaningless if investigators could not connect it to a specific individual. But these glasses were unusual. They contained a rare type of hinge, a design feature that was not commonly produced. Investigators learned that only a limited number of people in the Chicago area had purchased glasses with that particular construction. The search narrowed from thousands of possibilities to a much smaller group. Among those names was Nathan Leopold. The discovery created a sudden shift. A young man from a wealthy and respected family. A university student known for his intelligence. A person who seemed, on the surface, unlikely to be connected to such a crime. But investigations are built on questions, not appearances. Detectives needed to understand whether the connection was meaningful. Was it possible the glasses had simply been lost somewhere unrelated to the crime? Was Nathan Leopold an innocent person caught by coincidence? Or had investigators found the first direct link to the person responsible? The next step required conversation. When questioned about the glasses, Leopold provided an explanation. He stated that he had lost them while exploring outdoors and suggested that they may have fallen during one of his birdwatching activities. At first, the explanation appeared possible. After all, Leopold was known for his interest in nature. Birdwatching was not a random claim invented after the fact. It was part of his established personality. But investigators noticed problems. The location where the glasses were found was not simply a place where someone might casually lose an item while studying birds. The circumstances surrounding the discovery made the explanation increasingly difficult to accept. A single clue rarely proves everything. But clues rarely exist alone. They connect. They create patterns. And as investigators looked deeper, they began finding additional details that did not fit comfortably with Leopold's explanation. The image of the brilliant young scholar began changing. Not because investigators judged him by his background, but because evidence was creating a different picture. This was one of the first moments when the case challenged public assumptions. Many people struggled to accept the possibility that someone like Nathan Leopold could be involved. His education and intelligence had created an image of success and promise. He did not match the traditional idea of a criminal. But history has shown repeatedly that appearance and reality can exist far apart. A person's accomplishments can reveal their abilities. They do not automatically reveal their choices. As detectives continued examining the case, they also began looking more closely at Richard Lubb. The connection between Leopold and Lubb was already known. They were close friends who spent considerable time together. Their families knew each other. Their social circles overlapped. That relationship became increasingly important. If one person was connected to the crime, investigators needed to understand whether another person had been involved as well. The investigation moved from a question of evidence to a question of partnership. Could two young men from privileged backgrounds have planned something together? The idea seemed almost impossible to many people. But investigators followed facts, not expectations. They began examining timelines. They studied movements. They compared statements. And slowly, inconsistencies began appearing. Leopold and Loeb had attempted to create an explanation for their whereabouts, believing that a convincing story would protect them. But false stories often contain weaknesses that truthful accounts do not. A truthful memory may include uncertainty. A fabricated story often requires precision. Every detail must remain consistent. Every person involved must remember the same version. That becomes increasingly difficult over time. Investigators also began speaking with people who had information about the young men's activities around the time of the crime. Each conversation added another piece to the larger picture. The case was no longer about an unknown criminal hiding somewhere in Chicago. The focus was moving toward two individuals who had once seemed almost impossible to suspect. The irony was becoming clear. Leopold and Loeb had believed their intelligence separated them from ordinary criminals. Yet their greatest weakness came from the same confidence that had inspired the crime. They underestimated the people searching for them. They underestimated the importance of small details. And they underestimated how quickly a carefully designed story could collapse when exposed to simple questions. Why this location? Why these actions? Why this explanation? Each question placed more pressure on the illusion they had created. The investigation was approaching a turning point, but detectives still needed more than suspicion. They needed certainty. A case of this importance could not rely only on unusual glasses or questionable explanations. The evidence had to form a complete picture. That meant examining every connection, every statement, every decision made before and after Bobby's disappearance. The deeper investigators looked, the more they began to see a pattern. The crime was not random. The people involved had planned. They had prepared. They had believed they were capable of controlling the outcome. But planning leaves behind its own traces. The very preparation that gave Leopold and Loeb confidence also created evidence. Every step required choices, and every choice created possibilities for investigators to examine. The perfect crime they imagined was beginning to reveal something very human. It was imperfect. As the investigation continued, attention turned toward the relationship between the two young men and the story they had created to protect themselves. Their confidence would soon face the greatest challenge of all, direct questioning. And when investigators began testing their explanations, the carefully constructed world of Leopold and Loeb would begin to break apart piece by piece.